Righty. All good. Right. Good, okay, Tay. Let me just reinforce what Peter said about Tony Valentine. We were both looking forward to being here, but sadly, bereavement in the family. I've been teaching a course on called New Zealand Society and Religion across the road for over 30 years. And one of the things I tell students in my very first lecture, beginning of the course, is to pay attention to the ways in which historians write about religious people, movements and issues. Because often, when you look carefully and critically, you discover their language, the historian's language, suddenly becomes interestingly value-laden and morally charged in various ways. And I think that that's often especially true when writing about missionaries. And I can see Grant nodding. One of the things that I like about Eric Olson's latest book, The Origins of an Experimental Society, New Zealand 1769 to 1860, is that Eric aims primarily to understand our past rather than to judge it from some set of contemporary perspectives. And of course, that used to be the way historians all agreed we should proceed. I think it's one of the great strengths of Grant's little gene that in exploring the conversation between 7 Ngāpuhi Rangatira and almost that number of Anglican missionaries, he extends imaginative empathy, which is what we need to understand anybody in the past, especially those who are different from us in important ways, to both sides. I learned a lot from it, and I'll be adding it to my reading lists for all of the courses that I teach in New Zealand history. He's pleased about that. I think one of the great strengths of the book is that it catches Ngāpuhi Rangatira as they are beginning to adapt and reconfigure their own traditions and practices in the course of making Christianity their own. Of course, Hirini Carr's recent prize-winning book on the Māori Anglican Church provides much wider context for these transformations. But this is a nice, focused illustration of that kind of transformation. Now, I have to confess that I'd always assumed that Hongi Hika was a very traditional, old-style rangatira who basically dominated the missionaries and refused their message pretty comprehensively. Grant's book is forcing me to rethink. And his evidence is both illuminating and moving. Let me read a couple of paragraphs. From the top of page 67, for those of you who want to follow along. That evening, at James Kemp's, Hongi asked for his late son's red jacket killed in a recent war, wept openly and let his grief spill out. A rare vulnerability for a warrior priest. This request signals movement in Hongi's stance from justifying Hare's death as an honourable traditional cost that must be bravely borne, to recognising his own personal loss, sparked by the missionary's empathy. Clover, historian, writes the biography of Hongika, ties this to Hongi's dying wish in 1828, 3 years later, to spare his slaves, breaking custom, a kindness he linked to the missionary's care. This dialogue then planted seeds of aroha that softened traditional stances, reshaping Māori trust in the CMS. As for the missionaries, Grant's equally illuminating and, mostly, non-judgmental. Tony Ballantyne's entanglements metaphor, worked out in detail in his fantastic book Entanglements of Empire, published in 2014, aimed to highlight the enduring ways that missionaries, as well as Māori, were changed by their encounters with one another. Grant gets that. I want to read another passage. Page 69. It is notable that the missionaries who succeeded and settled in New Zealand were generally supported by wives and families that formed bonds of positive affect with Māori. And those who failed as missionaries had partners who were, and were themselves, more abrasive and hostile to Māori in their personal dealings. Butler and some others probably failed on this score. Davis, Clark and Taki, among others, seem mainly to have passed this test. Now, I think those are super sentences. And I just want to finish by suggesting that what Grant has noticed about this conversation in Kirikiri in 1835 is actually tremendously interesting, has just caught fire in one of my own research fields among historians of science. Historians of science in the last probably 15 years have become really interested in groups of people that they call go-betweens and knowledge brokers. That is, people like pilots, diplomats, entrepreneurs, but also missionaries who travel between worlds and have to learn to speak another language. In learning another language, they learn another culture. It's hard not to some degree. And one of the crucial insights that this new scholarship has developed is that for exchange of knowledge to proceed successfully, for go-betweens to succeed in kind of mediating between worlds, they have to establish relationships of trust, so that knowing, in the French sense of the verb savoir, knowing facts, knowing stuff about the world, turns out to be linked with knowing other human beings. The French verb connaître, those kinds of knowing are much more related historically than we have tended to think, and that's an insight that some feminist philosophers in recent years have picked up and developed. So all this is a way of saying that I think this little book is a gem that can easily be developed in all kinds of tremendously fruitful directions.